Hi, my name is Andrew Evans, and in this video, I'm going to be talking about Jerome Wakefield's 1992 paper, The Concept of Mental Disorder. So, in this paper, Wakefield begins by considering different accounts of mental disorder that have been put forward, and then he gives his own account, which has been very influential and which has been come to be called the harmful dysfunction analysis. For Wakefield, a condition counts as a mental disorder if it is a mental mechanism not performing its evolutionarily designed function and is harmful according to social norms. So here in his own words, Wakefield says, quote, "I argue that a disorder is a harmful dysfunction, wherein harmful is a value term based on social norms, and dysfunction is a scientific term referring to a failure of a mental mechanism to perform a natural function for which it was designed by evolution." So before I get into this question, I just want to note, I've put some videos out in the past about different approaches to defining mental disorder. And a lot of times I've grounded this in terms of norms, right? And Wakefield is interesting because he sort of combines norms. He's combining both biological norms and social norms. He thinks that it's both. So sometimes his uh, account can be referred to as a hybrid account. He refers to it in different places a hybrid account because it's both social and biological. But you'll notice if you read Derek Bolton's 2008 book, What is Mental Disorder, that Bolton refers to it as a naturalistic account. So it kind of depends how you want to look at it. But I do want to note that, we can think of this in terms of norms, like we discussed other theories of mental disorder in previous videos. Okay, so Wakefield does talk about some of these other approaches to defining mental disorder. So now I'm just going to move on to some of the things he has to say about them. And I'm going to focus in, he actually talks about lots of theories of mental disorder. I'm going to focus in on three that I've already introduced in other videos. So that is Saz, Kendall, and Sedgwick. Okay, Wakefield on SAS. So this is a quote from Wakefield. He says, quote, "SAS began with the assumption that physical disorder is a legitimate concept, that a disorder consists of a physical lesion, with lesion referring to a recognizable deviation in anatomical structure." So Wakefield, similar to Kendall, thinks that SAS has actually defined disorder wrong, whereas SAS thinks that a disorder must involve some sort of recognizable deviation from anatomical structure, some sort of like actual identifiable problem with the body, something that we can point to and say that here's the problem in the body, here's the dysfunction. Wakefield doesn't think that that's correct, and Kendall also pointed that out. So for Wakefield, a condition does not have to have some sort of physical lesion. Instead, what is required is that it impairs the ability to perform an evolutionarily defined function. So we'll get into a little bit what that means, but I just want to point out, so Wakefield can say something is a disorder without there being able to point to like, here's the body part, and you can clearly see there's a problem here. Instead, he takes a functional approach. It's about whether or not someone can function according to their evolutionary design. So that's where he differs from SAS. So SAS ultimately, does think that biological norms are what are relevant to illness, and he thinks mental illnesses don't exist because they involve social norms. And Wakefield is trying to answer that criticism by actually saying that his view of biological norms in illness is incorrect. Okay, Wakefield also talks about Kendall. He says, quote, "Both Kendall and Borse claim that a disorder is a condition that reduces longevity or fertility. The equation is faulty, however. A condition can reduce fertility without causing real harm. And some serious harms, such as chronic pain or loss of pleasure, might not reduce fertility or longevity at all." So, what Wakefield is pointing out here is that a condition that only reduces fertility or increases mortality a little bit, for example, isn't really a disorder, and it may not really cause harm, or the person may not even really notice it. Plus, there are some conditions that really seem like disorders that don't qualify as disorders under Kendall's definition. So, Kendall himself, if you remember from that video, brought up a condition like psoriasis. Psoriasis likely doesn't increase mortality or decrease fertility, but it's painful and we can treat it. So it does seem like perhaps it is a disorder. So Wakefield is also pointing out that weakness in Kendall's approach. Okay, and he also refers to Sedgwick. He notes that for Sedgwick, both physical and mental illness is socially constructed. So Sedgwick is kind of the extreme end. He thinks that all illness is based on social norms rather than biological norms. Um, Wakefield refers to this as the pure value position. And he says, quote, "The fact that all disorders are undesirable and harmful according to social values shows only that values are part of the concept of disorder, not that disorder is composed of only values." So what Wakefield is saying here is that Sedgwick is right that anytime we call something a disorder, social values are relevant and social norms are relevant. But he's saying that, there's another part to it, right? This is why Wakefield has a hybrid account. He doesn't just think that it's just social norms, but also biological norms are relevant. So for Wakefield, both social and biological norms are relevant. A condition is a harmful dysfunction, harmful according to social norms, and dysfunctional according to biological norms. Also, Wakefield brings up Sedgwick's claim that in nature, the fracturing of a femur and the snapping of a twig are the same, right? And this was an example that Sedgwick brought up to show that illness is a human label. Illnesses don't exactly exist in nature. That is a label that humans put onto organisms. But Wakefield disagrees. He says, quote, "However, completely aside from values, there is a relevant difference between the cracking of a femur and the snapping off of an autumn leaf. The leaf is designed to fall off at a certain stage, and the tree is not designed to require the leaf for its continued functioning. Whereas the possession of an intact femur is part of the way a person, even an old person, is designed to function." So, what is Wakefield saying here? Well, what he's saying is there's actually a difference between a femur snapping and a twig snapping. The tree is designed to eventually shed its leaves, and it doesn't need its leaves to function after a certain period of time. Whereas, we always need our femurs to function. So Wakefield is really shifting to his way of thinking about disorder as based on evolutionary design here in this quote. And that's one way he pushes back on Sedgwick's claim that all illness is really just socially constructed. All right, so let's get into Wakefield's own account of mental disorder. Wakefield thinks that to count as a mental disorder, a condition must be dysfunctional according to evolutionary design and harmful according to social norms. So we're going to look at each of these. Okay, so let's look at his views on function and dysfunction. Wakefield says, quote, "A natural function of an organ or other mechanism is an effect of that organ or mechanism that enters into an explanation of the existence, structure, or activity of the organ or mechanism." So, what does that mean? He's talking about biological things, right? Organs, mechanisms, processes that exist in organisms or organisms themselves. And he's saying, well, what does it mean for it to have a natural function? What are our natural functions? And he says that something's a natural function if it is used to explain why that organ or mechanism exists in the first place. So I'm going to read the second quote, and then I'll use some examples to kind of disentangle what Wakefield is talking about here. He says, quote, "Today, evolutionary theory provides a better explanation of how a mechanism's effects can explain the mechanism's presence and structure. In brief, those mechanisms that have happened to have effects on past organisms that contributed to the organism's reproductive success over enough generations increased in frequency and hence were, quote, naturally selected and exist in today's organisms." Okay. So Wakefield is giving an account of natural function here. He's saying for an organ or a mechanism in the body to be functioning naturally, then it must be doing that thing that it was sort of designed to do by evolution, right? So you have to be able to refer, if you want to explain why the mechanism exists, then you refer to its function. And evolution is the best theory to explain why we have the functions that we do. Okay, so let's apply this to some examples to get clearer on what he means here. So if we think about a heart, right? A heart is an organ, it's a very important organ on our body. Um, it has some natural functions, one of which is to pump blood. Wakefield thinks that pumping blood is a natural function of the heart because it enters into an explanation of why we have a heart. Why do we have a heart? Well, in order to pump blood. And then if we think, well, why though? How did we get this function? How does the heart have the function of pumping blood? And the best explanation we have is evolution, right? There was enough variation over time in our evolutionary history that pumping blood got selected for by evolution. And so the heart has the function now of pumping blood, right? It was designed by evolution to do so. Now, this is kind of easy to see for an organ like the heart or even physical mechanisms of the body. But what if we apply this to mental mechanisms, right? And that's ultimately what we're talking about is mental conditions. So suppose we have this person here who feels a lot of anxiety. For Wakefield, an important question would be, is the anxiety a malfunction according to evolution? So he would have to assume that the mind is designed to behave a certain way by evolution, and whether or not if someone's experiencing anxiety, we can then ask, is this anxiety functional? Is the mind doing its job in being anxious in this situation? Or is the anxiety dysfunctional? Is this some sort of mental mechanism failing to do what it was designed for by evolution? So it seems like anxiety probably is evolutionarily functional in certain cases. We do use it and need it in certain cases, but maybe there are cases in which it malfunctions and it's not performing in the way that evolution intended for it to perform, right? Maybe we're becoming too anxious in certain situations, or even not anxious enough in certain situations, right? That would be a malfunction for Wakefield, and then that would satisfy his dysfunction requirement, right? So that it would at least be dysfunctional. But he doesn't think that dysfunction is all there is to mental disorder. For Wakefield, a mental disorder is both harmful and dysfunctional. So he says, quote, "A dysfunction is not enough to justify attribution of disorder. To be considered a disorder, the dysfunction must also cause significant harm to the person under present environmental circumstances and according to present cultural standards." He says also, quote, "Disorder cannot be simply identified with the scientific concept of the inability of an internal mechanism to perform a naturally selected function. Only dysfunctions that are socially disvalued are disorders." So what is he saying here? He's saying that there's actually going to be a lot of things that are evolutionary dysfunctions, right? In our body and in our minds, there will be lots of times that it might not be functioning as it was designed. We don't actually want to call those disorders unless they're also harmful. And how we understand whether or not a condition is harmful is we have to look to social norms. So this is a way in which Wakefield brings together biological norms and social norms. A mental disorder is dysfunctional according to biological norms, right? Norms of evolutionary design. But it's also harmful according to social norms, right? What society disvalues if society considers something to be harmful. So we can apply this to the examples we just talked about. So suppose there are like minor defects in someone's heart, just really small defects, and those defects do show that the heart isn't functioning according to evolutionary design. If it doesn't really harm the person and the person doesn't really notice, then we wouldn't really call that a disorder or a disease. I mean, we might, but for Wakefield, he's saying we don't need to call that a disorder because it also has to be harmful, right? Same goes for the anxiety. So maybe you have slightly high anxiety in certain situations, and that anxiety is technically evolutionarily dysfunctional, For Wakefield, we wouldn't want to call that a mental disorder unless it's actually harming you, right? It's causing some sort of actual harm in your life. And then how we decide if something is harmful is social norms, right? Would society consider this amount of anxiety to be harmful? Okay. So I'll just conclude here by summarizing again Wakefield's approach. This has been a really influential approach to defining mental disorder and has received a lot of criticism since Wakefield put it out in the 90s, and he has defended it in various ways. I'm going to talk about Wakefield's approach more in future videos as well, especially when I talk about Derek Bolton's chapter 3. So it's really important that I introduce it and we get clear on what Wakefield's approach to mental disorder is. So to summarize, I'll end with this quote that I started with. He says, quote, "I argue that a disorder is a harmful dysfunction, wherein harmful is a value term based on social norms, and dysfunction is a scientific term referring to a failure of a mental mechanism to perform a natural function for which it was designed by evolution." All right, well, that is all I have for this video. Thank you for watching.